and welcome you to this rather inappropriately named Lunch and Learn webinar. If I can explain for those of you who are watching in the UK and indeed in the US, we at the Supply Chain School actually like to present our webinars while you're casually taking a sandwich or a short break for lunch. But since I'm in the UK and my colleague here, Clive Jordan, is in the US, I'm afraid he's eating breakfast and I'm looking forward to dinner. Nevertheless, the Lunch and Learn name has stayed with us. So today's event is all around demystifying BIM and follows on from an earlier Lunch and Learn webinar that we ran, where Clive gave some great presentations on making BIM usable and understandable and demonstrating some of the tools that Planoly has created to make the implementation of BIM process rather less frightening and somewhat simpler than it might otherwise be. And not only was the attendance at that event really good, but we had a lot of interaction with the audience and a lot of questions, and many of those questions remained unanswered. So I managed to persuade Clive to come back for a second event with us today, and I'm delighted to see you, Clive. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, good night, wherever you are in the world. I'm having coffee, but I'll pretend that it's the afternoon drink, and we're moving into, actually it's coming up to Thanksgiving in America, so there's a lot of winding down, and we could see something similar. But thank you for having us. Thank you for having us.
Pleasure. So a little bit of introduction. This webinar is part of a project that the Supply Chain School is tasked with delivering, and the project was funded by CITB, and it was called Downloading a Digital Mindset. So it was to look at whether the construction industry could benefit from digital investment and digital innovations. And of course, digital is now a very broad church indeed, but fundamentally BIM is a really important brick in the wall of digital technology, if I can put it that way. So my name is Dave Emery from the Supply Chain School. I'm a consultant with the school. My background is as an architectural technologist for many years. I also worked with my colleague Clive some years ago. We were part of a team that delivered some very early BIM projects in the UK. So early, in fact, that it wasn't even called BIM in those days. It was known as virtual construction. But I was very impressed with Clive's knowledge and skill even in those days, and I'm delighted we've managed to stay in touch. So Clive, do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself and Planoly?
Wow, yeah, likewise. Again, thanks for having us. But the journey of having BIM throughout different pieces of my career has been really interesting. I started as an engineer. My background is civil engineering. I was a builder, so a contractor. I've had the real benefit of being able to sort of sample each piece, but I've been an architect very briefly, and then an owner, and also now a software provider for the AEC space. And this is a second startup in the BIM and AEC, architecture, engineering, construction space. And we are now making it simple to implement a better, more seamless, more integrated planning process when it comes to BIM and getting value from it, and following being compliant to the ISO 19650 workflow, which I'm sure will come up in a bit later.
Sure. Thanks, Clive. I would have introduced my colleague Naomi, who has, with perfect timing, switched her camera off. She is behind the scenes. Hi, Naomi. She's a consultant researcher with the Supply Chain Sustainability School, and I like to think of her as the oil in the machine for this particular event. So hopefully by now in the audience, you'll have seen in the chat box, Naomi has put up a code and a link to a tool called Mentimeter. What we'd like you to do is to use your mobile phone, open a browser and go to menti.com, and you will be prompted for a code number, which Naomi's put in the chat box there. And we'd like to begin with a few simple questions about your experience of BIM. And then what this event is going to be, we're going to then expand it really into conversation that, in a sense, you in the audience will direct, because we're going to ask you a couple of questions about some of the acronyms, some of the roles and responsibilities, and find out which of these you are familiar with and which you're not. And then hopefully between us, Clive and I can demystify and simplify some of these processes, and then perhaps have a general conversation about some of our own experiences and what does actually implementing BIM mean to you and your business. So if hopefully most of you are managing to see the first slide in Menti, which will give Clive and me an idea of where you are on your BIM journey. So we'll just give that a minute or two to develop. What I'm immediately noticing, nobody is claiming that BIM is fully embedded into all projects yet, which is really interesting. It's not surprising, but in one sense, I think Clive and my experience is that very few businesses have it, what we would describe as fully embedded. But it does seem remarkable that some 5 years has passed since government mandated that BIM would be embedded in certainly public sector projects. But I think we've got a fairly even split between the people who are perhaps starting their BIM journey and people who are implementing it frequently, but it doesn't seem to have been fully embedded by anybody on the call. So thanks, Naomi. That gives Clive and me a feel for the audience. Could you perhaps go to the next slide? And audience, what we'd like you to do here, we know that the BIM world is absolutely full of acronyms. And Clive and I are smiling because even though we decided to put a list of acronyms together for you to decide which you knew about, even I forgot what one of these stood for this afternoon. So we'd like to know which ones you're familiar with and which are less familiar to you. And perhaps Clive and I can demystify some of those. Are there no trick questions? Yeah. Beg your pardon, Clive.
Well, I was just seeing that thankfully BIM is leading the charge there, but yeah, there's and great to see a lot of understanding across the board. So it's not just a case of BIM being the one acronym that everybody understands. That's great.
Yeah, so there are no trick questions here. Genuinely, these are acronyms that you will come across in the BIM world. And as we can see, BIM itself seems to be a concept that's understood, although I'm sure us BIM purists would argue that there are at least 3 different words that BIM can stand for, but let's not go there. So maybe, Clive, while those results are on the screen, let's start with the one that the fewest people know, which is the AIM. Talk us through what an AIM could be.
Absolutely. So when you create a 3D model, you have lots of different people complementing to it. You would have engineers creating ductwork and pumps, and you might have hangers and bracing, and you obviously have the walls, and there's lots of different models going in. And I remember actually somebody that you and I will both be familiar with, Mark Sawyer. He said, why use one model when 5 will do? And so this principle of having many models is sometimes useful to merge them together to understand what might be coordinated, what might not be coordinated. But when you come to actually handing over a model to an owner for its use in ongoing maintenance and life cycle for the building, they're really only interested in things that they would term an asset. And so the A is representing an asset. It's an asset information model. And this model is something that has lots of potentially 3D objects in, but also more importantly, the data that is related, the information related to maybe running a project and making sure that if you're wanting to perform maintenance on something, you know which items, where they're located, and then we can start going into things like sensor-based information and digital twins and a whole bunch of other nice terms and acronyms. But AIM stands for Asset Information Model, and it is produced from, it's a subset of the Project Information Model, which is a merging of all of the information models from all of the different disciplines. And the purpose of having an asset information model is to help teams to focus on what really needs to be provided to the owner, to the employer, to the appointing party at the end of the project or at certain stages throughout the project.
Thanks, Clive. Yeah, and the asset information model is something that I've heard Clive talk about BIM before. And if you, as a building owner, have great digital information in some sort of model, doesn't that enhance the value of that building, makes it easier to operate and maintain? But I think crucially, the point of the asset information model is not, this is not something that you will simply create as you hand over the building. The asset information model for me evolves from the inputs that begin right at very conceptual phase and can actually be carried right through procurement, construction, and delivery. And there are great financial reasons why you might want to help create an asset information model. If anybody's heard me speak before, I go back to a period when I was involved with a tier 1 contractor that no longer exists, that was tasked with designing, building, and operating a very large hospital for 30 years. And they recorded that the previous hospital that they'd built, when they'd given the handover data to the client, it was in the traditional form of PDFs and manufacturers' brochures, almost carrier bags full of information. And they calculated that the staff time to collate and deliver that had been something like £250,000. So if you can start to be thinking about your AIM as your model evolves, you're going to be delivering something great to you, client, at minimal cost to you. So where should we go next, Clive? I'm going to leave out PEP, Project Execution Plan, but I think IFC has got quite a low score, and I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, so IFC stands for Industry Foundation Classes. The name doesn't really help when you unpack it further, but it's really the data model for transfer of information. It's a way, when we talk about BIM being and we'll come back to BIM, but BIM being a tool or a piece of software that delivers a way of doing something in a 3D format. That's obviously the wrong explanation of what it is, but it's proprietary. It's something that you create as a Revit file or an ArchiCAD file. So it's a .rvt file or a .pln file. These are basically potentially closed systems that will only be openable inside of one of those tools. The IFC format, the way of describing a lot of different forms. So for AEC, it's the data model that we can communicate and in an open way. So instead of it being specifically for a vendor that provides a file format in a certain file format that only certain programs can open, the IFC format is a much more open format and a shared and collaborative and managed by Building Smart, so that we can have a way to communicate in our industry that is clear, that is future-proof, and that is a lot more open than a single file format.
That's a good explanation, Clive. I always think of an IFC as similar to a PDF in the sense that it's a completely neutral file format that most people can click on some tool or other and it will open a PDF, rather like a JPEG. It really doesn't matter what program you're using. If you double click a JPEG, you can probably open it and view it. What an IFC doesn't allow you to do, yet at least, is to, for example, open an ArchiCAD file in Revit or a Revit file in ArchiCAD, but it does allow a multitude of softwares to be able to explore the IFC file and gain useful information from it.
Yeah, there's a big watch this space on specifically IFC, because now there are programs, there are workflows that allow you to edit and therefore transform and edit and return files. A lot of really great progress that means that we can be more open and collaborative and positive and groovy when it comes to BIM, rather than negative and closed.
The jargon is called round tripping, isn't it, Clive? Is that the process?
Oh, there we go.
So the idea is you're supposed to be able to open something, do something to it, close it, and it still be as good as it was when you opened it. So I'm also interested that CDE scored quite lowly in this, Clive.
CDE. Where are you going to find something? That's the question. If you have just one place to find something, then it's more likely that you'll find it. If there is a defined way of naming, coding, applying metadata, additional data to files, etc., and you can find it by searching in one single place, you're likely to find it. If you have multiple places and you end up searching in email for a file, or in Dropbox for somewhere, in Google Drive for something else, in another platform for the same file, and you never really know which one's the latest version, that's going to cause problems on your project. You'll be using out of date data. You'll be really struggling to stay current with what is desired, what is required from you as a wherever you fall in that process. If you're using a drawing that is out of date, different version, etc., that's going to be a problem. So the CDE is a common data environment. It's basically saying, how do we put all of what we need in one place so that everyone knows how to search and find and manipulate it, essentially, when at the right time. So finding the information at the right time in a single place is really, really important. However, the big however, whenever you describe the CDE as one place, there is a big misconception that you only have one CDE, one common data environment, everything goes in that one place. Well, you can have multiple common data environments. It's just that you might use different tools for different purposes, and therefore different types of information you will find in certain places. So you might have a few common data environments. They might talk to each other. We as Plannerly are described as the BIM execution planning common data environment. That's where you would go to find the rules, the contract documents, the understanding of who does what when. That's a way of knowing exactly where you should go for certain information. So CDE stands for common data environment, and it's one place for one thing, but it can be many buckets as long as it's fully understood by the team about where to go for what.
And I think, well, just before I mention the BIM Execution Plan, the BEP, which you've already mentioned, before we go into that, just to reiterate Naomi's comments in the chat, treat this event audience like a surgery. So if you've got any BIM queries, whether or not we're talking about them, feel free to drop us a question in the chat and we'll do our best to answer it and demystify. So you mentioned the BEP acronym then, the BIM Execution Plan, Clive. And I think this will probably relate to our next slide, which is about roles and responsibilities, but talk us through a BIM execution plan.
So this is just, we've done projects forever, yeah, and we create information, but this transition to BIM and using 3D models and just slightly improved processes, let's say, compared to just creating a 2D drawing, slightly, but therefore there's almost a need for a set of rules, guidance, best practices, processes that are related to how you implement BIM. And that's really what a BIM execution plan is, BEP for short. Sometimes it's BXP in certain places as well. And the principle is that it's the one place to go for understanding the rules of the road. What are you doing from a BIM perspective? Who is doing it? Essentially as well, there are other parts to this, more acronyms that fall underneath the BIM execution plan. And really it's an umbrella term now for how do I deliver on the project. To confuse things further, it's also split into a pre and post appointment, post contract BIM execution plan, where you're able to have an owner that asks for, I would like BIM on my project, much more detailed, hopefully, and exchange information requirements, needing certain things at certain points in time for certain purposes. And in order for a team to bid on, for them to tender for respond to a tender on a project, there will be a part of a BIM execution plan which responds and says, these are the people. So you're putting the CVs in, you're putting the capability and capacity of the company, you're putting what the answers are to the questions that the owner has asked for in relation to BIM, how you have done BIM on projects before. It's like your BIM resume, your BIM CV. It's the response to the request. But then after the contract is awarded, or as the contract is awarded, there is a BIM execution plan that forms so you'll have the production methods and procedures, the whole understanding of the rules of engagement when it comes to creating and managing and setting up the CDE and who's responsible for what at what point in time. It's really that way of combining all of that into one single resource, not specifically a document, but it's a resource. And that's something that Plannerly has templates for to help as well, if that's something you guys are starting with.
I was going to ask you that, Clive, because I didn't know, but I was almost certain you would have. But I think you know, BIM execution plan sounds very technical, but actually it's just good practice in any project, isn't it, to set down the requirements of the client and how you're actually going to achieve them and who's responsible for doing what tools are you going to use and that sort of thing. And really that's what a BIM execution plan is.
Definitely.
So I think we've covered all of them except BIM, but nevertheless, do you want to have a comment on what BIM might stand for and what it is?
Well, we were joking before, so David had to look up BIM. No, we love this term BIM because it's like, and people love acronyms sometimes because they're snappy and they allow you to do something, share something really quickly and communicate very quickly. But BIM has been around as an acronym for so long, but yet there's still confusion as to what it really means. Even the statement of what do the letters stand for. So BIM, and actually a better way of describing BIM, instead of building information modeling or building an information model, or it's better information management. And that's what I really love. It's sharing how it's not just about a 3D model. It's not just about a process. It's not just about the people and the way that things are, it's about all of that. And if you're managing information in a more improved way on your project, you are doing BIM. Whether you have a 3D model or not, it's a kind of an interesting conversation, but a more advanced, a better way to manage information. And that is very much tied to creating information in 3D, having attached information, having referenced, linked out information. That ability to manage it in a more integrated form in a 3D model with a 3D model instead of a set of 2D drawings that are completely disconnected from each other and very difficult to manage when change occurs. So building information modeling is not a software. It's not BIM isn't Revit. BIM isn't just a one single process. It's about the whole workflow for the architecture, engineering, construction. It's about better communication. And that's probably the best definition for BIM is greater improvement in collaboration between companies and exchange of data for the improvement on a project. So yeah, BIM.
Yep. You can't buy BIM in a box, as they say.
There's yeah, you're right. Lots of conversations about what BIM is and what BIM isn't, but it's the snappy acronym that we have used to talk about this new way of working. Yeah, for a long time. And I'm sure there'll be still conversation over that.
Sure. We took a random selection of acronyms, but if anybody in the audience has another BIM acronym they're not clear about, drop it into the chat box and we'll endeavour to clarify it for you. So thanks audience for responding to that. Naomi, if we could go to the next question, please. We want to do a similar exercise here with you. The standards around BIM process now are defined in a document called ISO 19650, which was the subject of Clive's previous presentation. And I applaud all these standards that do endeavour to set out a roadmap and give us some clarity. But we find that there are an awful lot of job titles and appointments that may not at first sight be entirely clear. So I'll just ask you, audience, to have a look through these and see if you're comfortable with what these actually mean. And if you're not, Clive and I will endeavour to illuminate it. Again, BIM Manager has immediately taken the lead, and Information Manager closely followed.
So Information Manager, the most plain language role out of all of them, I'm sure. And I suppose at the same time, what information is it that they are managing? Does that matter? it depends on the industry and the type of company.
So I think those numbers are sort of settled down. Now we could do as we did before, Clive, and take the lowest score first, or we could take the highest score. Your call. Are we going to go to information manager, or are we going to go to appointer versus appointee?
Let's do appointor versus appointee. Should we do that first?
Let's do that.
Yeah. So for me, we talk about contracts. There's always two parties, and the most simple way to describe this is the person that is paying the bill is the appointor, and the person that is receiving the money for their services is the appointee. And the reason why this comes about in sometimes these terms are very foreign at first, but they make a lot of sense. They are very practical when it comes to the relation to exactly what that is. So instead of it being the owner, because the appointor could be somebody else in the supply chain, it's just simply a transaction between two people, two companies. And these come about through the ISO 19650 standards, which help us not just in the UK, but across the world, to talk the same language when it comes to this workflow, this tendering process. And I think that's sometimes it's going to be a speed bump in the road, because a lot of different terminology, not just the acronyms, but how you describe people in different roles in the supply chain also has an opportunity to change, but to align. And that's the principle. If everyone understands when I say the appointor, rather than we say the person that sent the contract to that team, it's more succinct, it's more precise. But we have in our industry gotten by with calling it a contract, and the contract was between the owner and the contractor. So we've got by, but this is something that helps us standardize that language across the globe. And some of these might be slightly foreign to start with, but they will, after one project, I'm sure, as you're using them on BIM projects or projects following ISO 19650, become familiar to everyone.
So in terms of ISO 19650, Clive, are these titles mandated, or are they there for our convenience?
So you can call that person. There's not a requirement to call certain parties certain things. The principle is that these are a unified way to describe it for the standards, and there's still leeway in all of the different workflows for project teams to use and implement something that's going to be beneficial for the project. So it's not, there are some you shall do this and you shall consider. So there are certain parts of the rule book as it comes to ISO 19650 that are mandated versus things that are more up to you on your project. But it's your project, and the client, if you want to call them the client, they are the ones paying the bill. So whether you call them the appointor, and they are the appointing party, so leading on to the first one in that in the row, it's really a project-based consideration. And the hope is that everyone starts to align more, because these terms, if we talk the same, if we used exactly the same language for every single project around the world, everything would be so much more efficient. So that's what the standards have tried to do, and we'll see. We're in this transition at the moment for a lot of teams.
Okay, so we've looked at appointor and appointee. So I think from left to right, those first three, do they need a little bit of further explanation? Or do you feel we've covered those?
And so appointing party, that is the client, the owner, the person who's paying the bill. The lead appointed party is potentially not just one party. It could be a few different, could be the architect that is directly contracted with the appointing party. It could be also the contractor that is directly contracted to the appointing party. It depends on the contract structure. And so that's the set of lead appointed parties, which are the people that they have a direct contract. And then you have a set of appointed parties, and that group of teams is the task team. And what you're simply saying is that team that is the appointed parties, it's really the ones doing the work most of the time. That's the most simple and seamless way to describe it. The appointing party is the person paying the bill. The lead appointed party is usually that party that is managing the rest of the supply chain. And then the appointed parties are those that are really doing the work.
Okay, brilliantly summed up. Thank you, Clive. Now, I'm intrigued by the final two columns on here, that people are professing knowledge of the details of a BIM manager and an information manager. Now, for me personally, there's some blurring at the edges across these two roles. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of blurring if you put BIM coordinator on there as well, and then you put project manager on there as well. There's a lot of there's lots of different parts of their roles that would potentially cross over. Information manager, when it comes to the inside of the ISO 19650 workflow, there is a specific clause. Something says that you, as the owner, the appointing party, must assign an information manager, the function for somebody to be in charge of and make sure that this workflow is followed, make sure that the exchange information requirements that you are requesting are clear, defined, has a purpose, tied back, following this workflow. So this concept of an information manager has been now codified in that ISO 19650 standard, but we've always had, this concept of an information manager, and maybe, information managers have in the past, and still are people that sometimes, we have drawing managers, or we have people that are more of a making sure that the whole project is running fluidly and people know where to access certain pieces of the data and information. And that role is a very much more instrumental role when you're trying to tie it all together with BIM. And that's why in the ISO 19650 standards, it is defined as a specific step for that appointing party and also the lead appointed party throughout that workflow at the right time when they get contracted. So managing information when the value of information is so high. And you mentioned, if we have an owner that requests an AIM, an asset information model with certain data in at a certain point in time, then you're going to need to have somebody manage that and make sure that that is handed over. There's somebody on the appointing party side that checks to say, yes, this meets our requirements. And that needs to be defined so that the asset information model is useful for the life cycle of the building and provides more value, and potentially, as you said, makes that building more valuable because you have so much more real-time information and ability to understand and to make real-time decisions based on the performance of the building and use it in renovation and everything else, that preventative maintenance, etc., as you go through the building.
I think in my experience, I'm not sure whether I would have been called a BIM manager or an information manager. I feel I've probably worked in those roles. But what's always struck me about this is the skills and the knowledge and experience that you need to be an information manager or a BIM manager. You certainly need a broad overview of the industry as a whole, don't you, Clive?
I think that there are a lot of people that find themselves in this role because they are the person that is most digitally savvy inside of a company. And sometimes they're great for that role from a technology perspective and from a process and helping people perspective. But as you mentioned, if they haven't got industry experience, it can be then an island of isolation. It can start to become a parallel process for a company. So that's, I think, one of the highest items on the list is an understanding of how the industry works, an understanding of how projects go together. And if you're a contractor, knowing, oh, okay, it's not just the case of we dig a hole and put concrete in it. There's a concept of we shore the the excavation, we have formwork, and there's a certain molding release agent that goes on the formwork, and we put rebar spacing, and we have blocks and space, and then we pour the concrete, and then we have to vibrate. It's kind of like understanding that, rather than if I'm a BIM manager and all I think is that there's a hole, got to excavate and put some concrete in it. It's a big difference between really truly understanding how a building goes together. So yeah, I think that's extremely important.
I think that's where I was going with that question, because certainly Clive and I have worked on projects where I may have been the architect stroke modeler, but in order to accurately create a model that reflected some cost information, I absolutely need to know the details of how that foundation gets in the ground, or how that concrete beam up in the air is cast, and so on. And what I found was, as an individual, even though I got a broad range of knowledge and experience, I didn't have the detailed experience properly to be able to input into the model without the direct support and assistance of the project manager, the quantity surveyor, the estimator, etc. So I see these roles as really difficult to define who is the best person to fulfill them and what skills they need. It's almost like some sort of superhero on the team, isn't it, to take on any of those roles.
When you list all of the potential activities for a BIM manager, you start to see people with VR and AR and MR acronyms. So virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality, and more other, there's others, there's like a mirrored base something or other. And so you think, okay, well, that's another way of visualizing the model. But then in order to collect data, there's now drone surveys, and suddenly you find a BIM manager that says, I'm certified to fly drones in these areas. And it's like, how many different types of technology related skills do these people start to have? And the list just gets longer and longer. So yeah, and my desire is to not have BIM roles. So this concept of a BIM manager is essential in order to get to the next stage where we're using better information management, building information modeling, 3D modeling, etc., as just a standard of care. And this is the way that our industry works. And at that point, it's just the project manager. So we didn't have project manager on here, but that's essentially the person, the role that is coordinating everything, and not, in the BIM manager's case, trying to do everything themselves. So there's this transition between somebody that is capable of doing all of these things and then upskilling the rest of the team so that it's more of just a management role. But really, BIM managers, you find them a lot of the time, it's a doing role. It's I'm executing work, and yeah, sometimes filling in and modeling this piece of the formwork and the temporary work so that we can get that submission in, or flying the drone to get the survey data for the land excavation, the massing, a whole bunch of different things. Yeah.
So earlier on, Clive, we asked anybody in the audience if they weren't clear on a job role or an acronym to throw them at us. So Noah Chamberlain has asked, can we tell him what a digital engineering is and a VDC manager? Which of those would you like to take?
So digital engineer first. This concept of digital is always an interesting one, because if you think a PDF, a file, or a drawing file in line work has been digital, but this has been more and more linked to the concept of BIM and implementation, as a digital engineer will be somebody that uses BIM workflows and implements 3D and a whole bunch of others on their projects. And I would liken and tie in a digital engineer sort of as a BIM manager, but it's the rebranding of, and we're always thinking up these new and beautiful ways to describe roles and different services and things so we haven't talked about, 3D, 4D, 5D, and ND based BIM. So when we start talking about digital engineer, are we going to have a digital twin engineer? And are we going to have a golden thread engineer? And are we going to have all of these other roles? It's open for, as we grow as an industry, but really it's because there are specialisms. And so digital engineer, in some countries is more prevalent than others. and then a VDC manager. I think that, so if I was to relate, in the UK, there's more digital. In the US, there's more VDC, and that concept of virtual design and construction, and a manager that manages that process rather than being just the BIM manager. You start to elevate it and have those other roles, and potentially a BIM manager that wasn't doing a drone survey now is a digital engineer, because they add that to, or sort of a VDC manager because they add that skill set to their, and they're not just managing BIM. So there's different ways of describing, but all of these people, all of these roles are related to that better information management, and how each piece comes together. I would hope starts to require less and less specific titles for this transformation, and more that we fall back to, there's a project engineer and a project manager, and we understand that these pieces of the workflow are just parts of the everyday activities that we perform.
Thanks, Clive. No, I hope that answers your question. Certainly, when you put up VDC manager, that for me, I feel more comfortable with that title if I'm engaged in those roles than BIM manager or information manager. I believe, first and foremost, virtual construction is a great description of what we're trying to do, but that's just a personal opinion. So thank you, Noah, for that, and thank you for acknowledging Clive's reply. We do have a fourth slide as we move towards the end of the session, where this is, if you're still on Menti, folks, this will give you a chance to submit any question you've got. I've noticed Naomi's used the plural of expert. I'd claim there's probably only one here, and he's sitting in a Plannerly logo T-shirt. But
that's not true.
while we wait for any other questions to come through, Clive, I know you and I have worked together, but you've clearly moved out to the US, and you've got lots of experience over there. One of the things that always fascinates me is our government believes that by setting standards here and putting some structure around the whole BIM concept and virtual construction concept, we will develop process that will be world-beating and world-leading. And I just wonder what your perception is, as having worked in the UK and the US, of where, relatively speaking, we are in terms of adoption of BIM.
I think so. I'm in a really fortunate position. I was born in the UK, grew up in the UK, worked in construction in the UK. I then transitioned, as you said, and I've been in the US for 10, 15 years, too long to remember. I've got 3 children. They were all born in the US. And I've sort of experienced both the design and construction side and also the implementation of BIM, and as standards have grown. And that's been a really interesting experience. And certainly they are completely separate. They're 2 different ways of doing things. One is, I relate the way that we're doing it in the UK. I say we, both sides of the ocean as well, that when I was a kid and my mum used to say, it's cold outside, make sure you take a coat with you. And what would I want to do? The last thing that I wanted to do was take a coat with me outside. I would wear my T-shirt, my jeans, and I'd be fine and I'd be cold. But because that advice, or that sort of mandating from your parents, it's such a human psychology is that you want to combat, especially as a child. So in the UK, the mandate is an interesting way. And I think that there is, obviously, when you have compliance and you have absolutely, this is the official, this is the way that it has to happen. There is a movement towards, because there's a necessity. I have to win work. I have to deliver it in this way. But there's also this whole supply chain that you bring, kicking and screaming in some form, but you're mandating. So you're moving the industry forward. There's a lot of awareness that grows from that, but sometimes people are reluctant to do that. And I think that it's almost sort of flipped in the US. There's no mandate, although there is a lot of conversation, and there's a memorandum of understanding between CDBB in the UK and the National Institute of
It's
Building
the
Science in the US.
Centre for Digital Built Britain.
Yep.
Just to explain
Another
acronyms.
acronym. Yeah, or I should have said CDBB and NIBS, just to keep the confusion level high. So what's happening now in the US is that there is more of a movement towards adopting ISO 19650 as a national standard. And that, coupled with what I didn't really explain, was almost the reverse of the mandate that's been happening, where it's more of a teams are implementing BIM, and so you'll see lots of very small engineering companies that are implementing it for the betterment for their company in the US, where they're standardizing a process. They are optimizing as much as they can and creating more efficiencies in their business. And then sometimes you get blown away by the supply chain saying, oh yeah, I've been doing this forever, and this is the way I deliver. And then it's about integrating their parts of their workflow into the supply chain. I'm not saying that's happening with every single company, every single engineering company, but you're seeing, I think, a bigger diversity between those that are, so in the task team or the delivery team, the people that are really caring about implementing this for their efficiency, rather than being told to do it and making it a checkbox and sending the deliverable up the chain, but really staying and doing something completely different as a parallel process. So I think that there's, pros and cons to both ways. I'm really excited that there are mandates coming to the US as well, and more of a, this is the way that we will do it as a national standard. We see the same thing happening in Canada. We see that same thing happening in a lot of other countries. And the reason why we can do that is because of the mandate that happened in the UK and the standards that have evolved from that, and the push to talk the same language, have this common language and a framework that is ISO 19650 now. So all of the great work that was done on the PAS standards, PAS 1192, and all of that testing and mandating that workflow to be able to make sure that it's of a sufficient, I was going to say simplicity, but probably not, that's not the word, but something that can be used and can gain value, can get traction, can be useful. So now that that's happened, taking that to the rest of the world, that wouldn't have happened without the mandate in the UK. So
yeah, I think you're right. I don't think current standards are just simply arduous and complicated standards that are being imposed on us. They are the result, aren't they, of good work and experience.
Absolutely.
And trying to simplify it. And I can see the time going around. I'm delighted with the number of questions coming in, but one of them is around is BIM being overcomplicated. And I think many people will make it so. But I think my mission in life, and I'm sure Clive's is, and the object of some of these standards is to try and simplify and bring down that level of complication. And I'm sorry, that's a very short answer to that question, but I can see the clock ticking around. Do you want to just explain what COBE is? I know in 60 seconds.
Construction Operations Building Information Exchange. So the principle there is, how do you create data that teams on an operational sense can use, and it needs to be standardized. And so that's a way of transferring information. And it doesn't set out, this is exactly what you need to provide. It says, this is the structure, and you would need another tool to be able to provide the, what do you need, when do you need it, who needs to do it. And then the result is very, very much understood, this COBE file that could be an Excel spreadsheet usually. And that is the data that is interesting for the owner to operate and maintain the building.
Yeah. See, I always say that COBE spreadsheets were never meant to be read by human beings. They're far too tedious and complicated, but in essence, they define what the building is, where this particular object or system or area is in the building, and some certain key characteristics about it that can be transferred to other systems.
Yeah, what's the warranty for this pump, and who would you call if it's within this date that's defined as the end date of the warranty, for example?
I believe it was actually based on the system that the American military used to operate all their work bases all over the world.
Yep.
Horrendously complicated, not very easy on the eye. Any tips to taking clients on the BIM journey, Clive?
simplify it and show them examples. I think that the biggest thing that we see as the wrong way to do it is people coming in with loads of acronyms and trying to impress an owner, a client, and saying, we do BIM and we do all this. And actually, it's just showing examples, because if you can take them through a fly through, I remember working on the Olympics for London Olympics, and basically seeing a fly through and being able to generate a time-bound full site model of essentially 4D of a simulation of the buildings going up. That was so much more powerful than you're talking about Kobe as an exchange information, or sending a load of parameters of properties this way, that way, or talking about an asset information model, or exchange information requirements and helping the owner with those specifics. It's just showing examples. This is the end result. This is what you could be using. This is how you could be using the data from management of information. This is how it could be flagged, maybe where you would want to tie in, and maybe it's going far enough with certain owners, and maybe further when we talk about digital twins. And I hate kind of overselling the potential, because sometimes the owner doesn't really care about the building. A lot of the time when you have a contract, you're building the building, but you're not really the person that's going to maintain the building. The person that is going to be occupying the building is a completely different client, completely different customer compared to the one that you're talking to. So yeah, how do you take them on a BIM journey? Show them.
Yeah, I think part of my answer to that would be find out what your client's drivers are. So for example, if it's quality, I think we could make a case that BIM will drive out errors and rework. If it's cost certainty, again, I think we can demonstrate that using BIM process can bring certainty. So talk to your client on his terms. What are his main drivers? And I'm sure you can support the achievement of those desires with BIM.
And try not to do too much as well. I think that there's so you can have three things in a project: the quality, the cost, or the time. Yeah, as in you can't have all three. You can't maximize the quality, maximize the cost, and maximize, return it. It's what is it? It's good, fast, and cheap are the things. You can't have a good project that's fast and cheap. You have to pick two of them. You have to say, I want a good project and it can be fast, but it can't be cheap. So that combination is
the time cost quality triangle, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'll read the next question. I'm not quite sure I understand this. Is it possible to move from quality assurance to BIM field? As I believe digital is the present and future. If so, what skills are required? Is it possible to move from quality assurance to BIM field?
To try and read between the lines, I'm presuming using BIM in the field for quality assurance.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah. I think that was, where's that code coming from?
Yeah, so instead of it just being a design model that is used for coordination and making sure that things don't clash, there is a huge amount of use for the model in the field for sure. And when you see all of the great technology now that could automatically from a scan quantify the work in place, and then also you think about tagging items instead of it being sent on an email or just something that is a line item on a list. It's actually, this is a quality assurance issue. This is a fix. This is a snag. This is a defect. And it's on this item, or it's on this door. This door doesn't close properly, or it's got the wrong hardware, or there's a chip in the wall, and all of these things. Instead of it just being a blue piece of tape that people have to go around and spot, you can see them digitally, not just in a list, but also related in a model connected to those elements that have the problem. So maybe that answers some part of the question.
Yeah, there's a tool I've seen where even during construction, you can take a snap of a problem on your iPhone. And if your model is located correctly in geometric terms on a country-wide, worldwide grid, you can actually locate the problem in the model. And it effectively becomes a site diary. You're tagging a piece of information on a date in a location in the model. So I think we've covered are we overcomplicating things? No mention of how to make obligations contractual. What are your thoughts on the information protocol?
Yeah, so the information protocol is a great resource. It's basically the legal language to help you to ensure that what you're doing is contractual. So, and there's a great template that's available, and it is a UK based thing, but it can be used around the world. It's the most simple way to define, and it's defined. So, and we have the template inside of Planoly as well. You just fill in where you find each piece of the puzzle. So where is the EIR? And you can put a link. This is where you would find the EIR.
Employer's information requirement, Clive.
Exchange information requirement. Yeah,
sorry,
yes. Yeah, but so the principle is, where do you find requirements for that the owner has requested? Where do you find the BIM execution plan and how to follow what you're contractually obligated to do? And yeah, that legal language ensures that what you put in a BIM execution plan is actually something that forms part of the appointment documents, the tender. Make sure that they are legally binding. So there are lots of different contracts around the world, but this one has been part of the contract language has been defined specifically for BIM and following that ISO 19650 workflow.
Okay, thank you, Clive. We are running very, very short of time. I've got a couple of other questions still waiting to be answered. I think we can deal with one or two of them as a yes/no answer. But meanwhile, if you could just draw your attention to Naomi's comment, it's really important to us to get feedback from these sessions. So if you wouldn't mind clicking that link, even if you do it when the session ends, or click the link now and fill in the form when the session ends, that would be great. Next question, should BIM consultants take more care of client money and focus on education rather than selling software they don't need? I think that requires quite a short answer.
Yeah, we'd love, I mean, our focus is simplify and create value. So if you're buying stuff that's not needed.
Yeah, I don't regard somebody who sells software as a BIM consultant is my very brief answer to that. How do we ensure?
Sometimes that's what they are pushing, though. Yeah. And certain platforms, certain tools.
It comes back to this concept: you cannot buy BIM in a box. So yeah, don't confuse BIM with software. So how do we ensure BIM preserves the right design intention information until the end?
That's a great question. How do we ensure that? So if you are defining a requirement, and that might be as an owner, as an appointing party, and you say, on my previous projects, I've used this brand of toilet or door or whatever it might be, and I love it. I want that to be in my project. How do you make sure, first of all, that it gets added to the model? Then how do you make sure that it's in the final model that's constructed from? How do you make sure that it was what was installed or is installed on site? How do you make sure that all of the information related to that object is correct and present? There's lots of different tools in that workflow, and we believe in having a grid showing those specific requirements, who is responsible, and making sure that that flows not just from design intent, but right the way through to the handover of the asset information model at the end of it. So that's where in Planoly the scoping comes in. Hopefully that would help you and maybe I'm reading that question and answering it with a Planoly answer, but that's how we would help to do that.
I share the questioner's concerns. I've had experience where a clear design intent has been embedded in the model, but some buyer somewhere along the line has invoked the or similar approved clause, and things haven't turned out as we discussed. I think there's a whole conversation there. I also think I'm really intrigued by the question, how do we get 3D models that provide useful data, for example, for a QS? And again, I've got real world experience of where that's gone well and where it's gone horribly wrong. And what I'm thinking on my feet, because I've now run out of time, is that potentially we could run another session on that, about some of the yeah, the problems of giving useful data to other parties who are not necessarily architects or people who are capable of engaging with the model directly. So if we can put that to one side, I'm sorry I can't answer that question today. Is there any BIM Chartered Institute or similar is the final one. Clive, I suppose I'd be better talking about the UK. There are a number of accredited courses. I'm just trying to think. The RICS has a BIM qualification. There are one or two other institutes, I can't just think of them off the top of my head, but perhaps we'll send out those links with the follow-up email from Naomi. I noticed also in the chat as we just run into the last few seconds, yeah, somebody's asked if they could have a copy of these questions, which we'll happily do. We'll send you them out with the answers you've given us today. So as happened, sorry, Clive, after you.
I just saw the clarification on the design intent about preserving the golden thread until the end. Yeah, absolutely. That's another conversation actually, as far
Absolutely.
as the golden thread. Yeah, so the importance of fire, life safety information, it can't be something that you can just expect without having some kind of regulation around it. Now there is really a big push specifically in the UK about that because of obviously what happened at Grenfell, and also we experienced something in Florida where building collapse could have been prevented potentially if there was an understanding of data that had been related right the way through, and something that could have been foreseen. So yeah, the golden thread of information, man, we could talk about that for a long time, but making sure what is designed is actually built, and as you said, you know, the right products being used rather than substitution is yeah, not getting paid for that building at handover if it doesn't comply. That's really where we are going with regulation, and that's the sort of thing that should be also transferred around the world from the great stuff that, you know, I think that there's so much amazing work done in pioneering from a standards perspective in the UK that everyone else in the world is benefiting from. So yeah, that's very important for sure.
Thanks, Clive. There are two ways of viewing the two sessions we've done with Clive. One is that on both occasions we've overrun and we've not answered all the audience questions, which could be seen as a signal failure. I rather think it's a measure of success in that Clive is so knowledgeable that he's able to field all these questions from an audience that could be, as far as I know, spread all over the world. So really sorry that we've overrun. Hope it's been of value to the audience. Extremely grateful to Clive Jordan from Plannerly, and I look forward to the next webinar when it will be at lunchtime. So session is now closed. Thanks for attending.